At a bustling coffee shop in downtown Seattle, a heated exchange erupts when Karen Hampton, an outspoken activist, accuses an older gentleman, James Thatcher, of being a war criminal. The retired Army veteran sits quietly, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Karen's fiery accusations. As onlookers gather, murmurs fill the room. What happens next will take everyone by surprise, as James's response unravels a story of sacrifice, humanity, and a haunting truth that leaves everyone questioning their own assumptions. Karen Hampton stood at the counter of her favorite coffee shop, scrolling through her phone while waiting for her latte. It was an unremarkable morning in downtown Seattle. Gray skies loomed overhead, the muted hum of traffic blended with the occasional clatter of cups behind the counter, and the barista called out orders with mechanical precision. Karen's eyes wandered aimlessly across the bustling café until they landed on an older man sitting near the large window. He wore a weathered green jacket adorned with military insignia. His hands, rough and scarred, rested on a folded newspaper that lay untouched on the table beside him. His posture was straight, his face deeply lined with age and experience. He stared out the window, seemingly lost in thought, as though the world outside the glass was far more vivid to him than the warm, bustling café. To Karen, he wasn't just another customer enjoying his coffee. He was a symbol, an emblem of everything she stood against. Her mind raced with indignation, images flashing through her thoughts. War zones reduced to rubble, families torn apart, and the human cost of conflicts she had read about in articles and documentaries. She felt the familiar rise of self-righteous anger building inside her. To her, his jacket and insignia were not marks of honor, but of complicity in a system she deeply opposed. Karen had never been one to shy away from confrontation, especially when it came to matters she felt strongly about. Without hesitation, she walked over to his table, her latte in hand, her steps firm and deliberate. The soft murmur of conversations faded as her heels clicked against the tiled floor, drawing the attention of nearby patrons. "Excuse me," she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the café. "I couldn't help but notice your jacket. Are you a veteran?" The man looked up slowly, his piercing blue eyes meeting hers. He took a moment to study her, his gaze steady and calm, before answering. "Yes, I am," he said simply, his voice measured and composed. Karen crossed her arms tightly, her posture rigid. "Well, I hope you're proud of yourself," she said, her tone laced with sarcasm. "Proud of all the lives ruined, the countries destabilized, and the innocent people who paid the price for wars they never asked for. How do you even live with yourself?" The café grew silent. Conversations ceased, and curious eyes turned toward the unfolding confrontation. James Thatcher, though Karen didn't yet know his name, didn't flinch. He remained seated, his expression unchanged, his calm demeanor starkly contrasting her fiery accusations. "I live with myself one day at a time," he replied evenly, his voice neither defensive nor apologetic. Karen's face flushed with anger. "That's it? That's all you have to say?" she snapped. "You can't seriously expect me to believe you don't have any regrets or guilt for what you've done?" James sighed softly, leaning back in his chair. "I didn't say that," he replied, his tone unwavering. He gestured toward the empty chair across from him. "Why don't you sit down? If you're going to accuse me, you might as well hear my side of the story." Karen hesitated, glancing around at the growing audience. Part of her wanted to continue berating him, to call him out in front of everyone, but another part, a quieter, more uncertain part, wondered what he could possibly say in his defense. Reluctantly, she pulled out the chair and sat down. James studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "I don't blame you for being angry," he said finally. "War has caused more harm than good throughout history. But let me ask you something. What do you know about it? Not what you've read online or seen in documentaries, but what do you really understand?" Karen straightened her posture, her voice steady. "I know enough to understand that it's wrong, that it destroys lives and leaves entire generations traumatized. James nodded thoughtfully. You're right about that. War is wrong. It's brutal, messy, and full of contradictions, but it's also something you can't fully understand unless you've lived it. His gaze drifted toward the window, and his voice softened as though he were speaking more to himself than to her. I joined the army when I was 19. I didn't do it because I wanted to fight. I did it because I believed in protecting the people I loved and standing up for what I thought was right. But believing in something doesn't mean you always make the right choices. Karen leaned forward slightly, her curiosity piqued despite herself. And did you? She asked. Make the right choices? James was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, tinged with a sadness that hadn't been there before. Sometimes, but not always. And those are the choices that stay with you, the ones you question over and over, even decades later. The room seemed to hold its breath as James continued. I've seen things no one should ever have to see. I've done things I wish I could take back. But I've also saved lives. Not because I'm a hero, but because I was there, and I had to make decisions in the moment. Decisions that didn't always have a clear right or wrong. Karen stared at him, her earlier anger replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. So, what are you saying? She asked. That we should just excuse everything because it's complicated? James shook his head. No, I'm saying that you should seek to understand before you judge. There's more to every story than what you see on the surface. He gestured toward her coffee cup. Think about it like this. When you ordered that latte, did you think about where the coffee beans came from? About the farmers who grew them, or the journey they took to get here? Karen blinked, caught off guard by the sudden shift in the conversation. No, she admitted. Exactly, James said. But that doesn't mean the story isn't there. It just means you haven't seen it yet. Karen sat across from James, her latte untouched. Her earlier confidence had wavered, replaced by an uncomfortable silence. The sounds of the café, a clinking spoon, a muffled laugh, the hiss of the espresso machine, blurred into background noise. She glanced at the older man in front of her, his face lined with decades of stories she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. He didn't rush to speak, didn't fidget or grow defensive. Instead, he waited, as though giving her the space to decide if she wanted to listen. All right, Karen said finally, leaning back in her chair. If you've got something to say it. I'm listening. James nodded, his expression thoughtful. You said earlier that I should feel guilty, he began, his voice calm but steady. And I do. But guilt isn't a simple thing. It's not black and white, and it doesn't go away just because you want it to. Karen crossed her arms, skeptical. Sounds like you're already making excuses. James looked at her, his gaze unwavering. I'm not making excuses, he said firmly. I'm telling you what it's like. You look at me and see a symbol, a uniform, a role, a history you think you understand. But war isn't a headline or a movie. It's people, Karen. People with families, dreams, and regrets. And in the middle of it, you're forced to make choices no one is prepared for. He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. Let me tell you about one of those choices. It was my second deployment. We were in a remote village, a place not even on most maps. Our orders were simple. Secure the area, eliminate threats. But when we got there, it wasn't threats we found. It was families, mothers, children, elders, just trying to survive. Karen frowned but didn't interrupt. Something in his tone had shifted, and she found herself listening despite herself. We were told to hold our position, to wait for further instructions. James continued, his voice quieter now, as though the memory itself demanded reverence. But then the bombing started. Not from us, from the enemy. They didn't care who was in the village, didn't care about the women and children who would be caught in the crossfire. To them, it was just a target. He paused, his jaw tightening as he looked down at his hands. I had two choices, follow orders and stay put, or risk everything to get those people out. I chose the latter. We loaded as many as we could onto our vehicles, but there wasn't enough room for everyone. I had to look into the eyes of people I couldn't save, knowing what would happen to them when we left. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her arms relaxing slightly. The café seemed quieter, the hum of life around them muted by the gravity of his words. "And what happened to the people you left behind?" she asked, her voice softer now. James's shoulders sagged slightly, the only sign of the weight he carried. "They didn't make it," he admitted. "And I think about them every day. Every single day." Karen stared at him, her earlier anger replaced by something she couldn't quite name. Sympathy? Empathy? She wasn't sure. "And you think that makes up for everything else? The wars, the destruction?" James met her gaze, his expression unflinching. "It doesn't make up for anything. It's not about justification or forgiveness. It's about understanding that in war, and in life, the choices we make are rarely black and white. They're gray, and those gray areas haunt you." Karen sat back, her mind spinning. She had come to this table expecting a villain, someone to embody everything wrong with the world. But the man sitting across from her wasn't a villain. He wasn't a caricature or a headline. He was a person, flawed and complicated, just like everyone else. "So, what do you want me to do?" she asked finally, her voice tinged with frustration. "Just let it go? Pretend it never happened?" James shook his head. "No, I don't want you to let anything go. I want you to question, to challenge, to hold people accountable. But I also want you to remember that the world is more complicated than it seems. It's not enough to point fingers. You have to be willing to listen, to understand." The silence between them stretched, not uncomfortable but heavy with unspoken truths. Karen glanced down at her latte, the foam now deflated and clinging to the sides of the cup. She thought about his words, about the story he had just shared. It wasn't enough to erase her anger or change her beliefs, but it was enough to make her pause. Finally, she looked back at James. "You said guilt is complicated. Do you still feel it? For what you did, or didn't do?" James didn't answer right away. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, almost a whisper. "Every day," he said. "But guilt isn't just about feeling bad. It's about what you do with it. For me, it's a reminder. To be better, to do better, even when it's hard." Karen nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. For the first time, she didn't see James as an enemy or a symbol, but as a person. And that, she realized, was harder than anything she had expected. Karen remained seated across from James, her thoughts tangled in a web of doubt and curiosity. She had walked into this confrontation ready to label him a villain, yet his words had unsettled her. The way he spoke about guilt, about impossible choices, it didn't excuse what she saw as his complicity, but it painted a picture far more complex than she had anticipated. "Let me ask you something," she said after a pause, her voice calmer. "If you regret it so much, why did you even join? You must have known what you were signing up for." James tilted his head slightly, considering her question. "I joined because I believed in something. I grew up in a small town where serving your country was an honor. My father was a firefighter. My grandfather fought in World War II. It wasn't just a job, it was a calling. I thought I'd be part of something bigger, that I'd make a difference." "And did you?" Karen pressed, crossing her arms again. "Did you make a difference, or was it all for nothing?" James sighed deeply. "I wish I could give you a simple answer. I've seen the worst humanity has to offer, but I've also seen courage, kindness, and sacrifice. War doesn't just destroy lives, it reveals them. Did I make a difference? Sometimes. But not in the way I thought I would." Karen leaned forward, narrowing her eyes. "That sounds like a cop-out." "Maybe it does," James admitted. "But let me tell you a story, one that stayed with me all these years." Karen hesitated but gestured for him to continue. It was during my first deployment. We were stationed in a region plagued by insurgent attacks. Our mission was to secure supply routes, but the roads were treacherous, lined with IEDs and ambush points. One day, while patrolling, we came across a young boy, no older than 10, standing by the road. Karen raised an eyebrow. What was he doing there? At first, we thought he might be a scout for the enemy, but he wasn't watching us. He was guarding something. Karen's curiosity got the better of her. What was it? A dog, James replied softly. The boy's dog had been injured, its leg caught in rubble from an earlier explosion. He didn't want to leave it behind, even though staying there put him in danger. Karen blinked, caught off guard. And what did you do? We approached cautiously. When he saw we weren't going to hurt him, he begged us, through gestures and broken words, to help his dog. We didn't have to. It wasn't our mission, and stopping put us at risk, but I couldn't just walk away. He paused. We bandaged the dog's leg, gave the boy some food and water, and stayed until they were safe. That boy smiled at us as we left. This pure, grateful smile. It wasn't much, but in that moment, it felt like the only thing that mattered. Karen sat back, her arms uncrossing. That's not what I expected. James nodded. Most people think war is just violence and destruction. And it is, but it's also full of moments like that, where humanity shines through the chaos. Those moments don't erase the guilt, but they remind you why you keep going. Karen was quiet, her gaze fixed on the table. So, you're saying the good outweighs the bad? James shook his head. No, the good and the bad coexist. They're intertwined. That's what makes it so complicated. Karen wanted to argue that he was still part of a machine that caused suffering, but she couldn't ignore the sincerity in his voice. Do you ever wonder, she asked, if there was another path you could have taken? Something that didn't involve all this pain? Every day, James said, but life doesn't give you do-overs. You make your choices, and you live with them. The only thing you can do is try to make the best of the path you're on. Karen nodded slowly, her walls beginning to crack. You said guilt is a reminder. A reminder of what? To be better, James said. To do better. To never forget the cost of my actions and to make sure that cost isn't in vain. He leaned back slightly, his eyes taking on a distant look. I've seen things that haunt me, Karen. Faces, places, moments frozen in time. Some good, some bad. But the weight of it all, those choices, those outcomes, it's something you carry forever. Guilt doesn't disappear. It just changes. It becomes something you live with, a part of who you are. Karen looked down at her hands, her earlier anger dissipating. It must be exhausting, she said quietly. James gave a faint smile. It is, but it's also what keeps me going. If I forget, if I stop caring, then the weight of those choices becomes meaningless. And I can't let that happen. The two of them sat in silence, the tension between them easing. The noise of the café began to creep back in, grounding them in the present. Karen looked at James, seeing him in a new light, not as an adversary, but as someone who had lived a life far more complex than she had imagined. For the first time, she wondered if she had been too quick to judge. And for the first time, James wondered if someone else could truly understand the burden he carried. The cafe door opened with a soft chime, and a rush of cold air swept through the room. Karen glanced toward the door, distracted by a couple entering, their laughter a contrast to the silence at her table. She looked back at James, who seemed lost in thought, his fingers tracing the rim of his coffee cup. So, Karen said, breaking the silence, you've told me about guilt and impossible choices. But what happens after? How do you move on from something like that? James leaned back, his gaze distant. The truth? You don't. Not completely. People like to talk about closure, but some things stay with you. You learn to carry it, to live with it, but it never really goes away. Karen frowned, tilting her head. That sounds bleak. It's not meant to, James replied. If we forgot the weight of our choices, the cost of our actions, we'd stop being accountable. The pain reminds you to do better. Karen studied him. For the first time, she noticed the faint tremor in his hand as he lifted his coffee cup. So, what do you do now? She asked. You're not in the military anymore, right? No, James said. I retired years ago. Now I work with veterans, helping them transition back into civilian life. It's not easy for most. You spend years in a world where everything is structured, where you have a purpose. Then you come back to a world that feels aimless. Karen leaned forward, intrigued. Do you feel that way too? Aimless? James hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. Sometimes. But I found purpose in helping others. It's not the same as before, but it's something. And maybe that's enough. Karen nodded, her skepticism giving way to grudging respect. I guess that's admirable. James gave a faint smile. I don't know about that. It's just what I can do. And honestly, I think a lot about the people we left behind, the lives we couldn't save. Helping others is my way of honoring them. It's not enough, but it's something. Karen looked down at her latte, her thoughts swirling. She had come prepared to confront him, to demand answers. But now she wasn't sure what she was even arguing for. James wasn't the person she had imagined. He wasn't an unrepentant war criminal or a blind patriot. He was human. And that complicated everything. Do you think, she began cautiously, that people like me, people who've never been to war, have the right to judge you? James considered her question carefully. Yes and no, he said finally. You have the right to question, to hold people accountable. But judgment, that's trickier. It's easy to see things in black and white when you're not in the thick of it. But life, especially war, is full of gray areas. That's not an excuse. It's just the truth. Karen leaned forward. But doesn't that let people off the hook? Doesn't it make it too easy to justify terrible things? James shook his head. No, accountability is important, but so is understanding. If we don't try to understand why people make the choices they do, we can't learn from them. And if we can't learn, we're doomed to repeat the same mistakes. The weight of his words hung in the air, and Karen found herself nodding, though she still wrestled with lingering doubts. She didn't know if she fully agreed with him, but she couldn't deny the logic. So, what's the lesson then? She asked. What am I supposed to take away from this? James looked at her, his expression serious. The lesson is that the world is complicated. People are complicated. And the only way forward is by trying to understand each other, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Karen sat back, her mind racing. This wasn't the conversation she had expected, but maybe that was the point. Maybe the most important lessons were the ones that came from the unexpected. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of the café filled the silence between them, grounding them in the present. Karen looked at James, really looked at him, and saw not a soldier or a symbol, but a man, flawed, complicated, and undeniably human. I'm not saying I forgive everything, she said finally, her voice quiet but firm. But I think I understand a little more now. James nodded, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. That's all anyone can ask for. And with that, the conversation shifted. They talked about lighter things, the weather, the best coffee shops in the city, even the books they were reading. But beneath it all, Karen could feel the weight of what they had discussed, the unspoken truths that lingered in the air. When Karen finally stood to leave, she felt different, changed somehow. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time, she was okay with that. Some questions, she realized, didn't have simple answers. And maybe that was the point. As Karen walked to the door, she glanced back at James. He offered her a small, knowing smile, and for the first time, she smiled back. Understanding, however fleeting, was a start, and sometimes a start was enough. Karen walked down the bustling streets of the city, the crisp winter air biting at her cheeks. The conversation with James replayed in her mind, each word and phrase echoing louder than the hum of traffic around her. For someone who had entered the café certain of her beliefs, she left feeling unsteady, as if the foundation beneath her had shifted ever so slightly. The world around her was alive with activity. Street vendors shouting their wares, pedestrians bundled in thick coats hurrying past, and the faint sound of carolers singing somewhere in the distance. Yet, Karen felt removed from it all, her thoughts pulling her inward. She stopped in front of a bookstore, its display window adorned with twinkling lights and stacks of books wrapped in decorative paper. Something about it drew her in, and she pushed open the door, a small bell jingling overhead. The warm, inviting smell of paper and coffee greeted her, and for a moment she let herself forget the weight of the morning's conversation. Karen wandered through the aisles aimlessly, her fingers brushing against the spines of books. She wasn't looking for anything in particular, but her eyes kept catching on titles about war, history, and resilience. Finally, she picked up a slim volume with a faded cover titled Reflections of the Front Lines. She turned it over, reading the description on the back. The book promised first-hand accounts of soldiers, medics, and civilians whose lives had been forever altered by war. Karen hesitated. The last thing she wanted was to immerse herself further in the complexities James had opened up to her. Yet something compelled her to carry the book to the register. As the cashier rang up her purchase, Karen's phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out to see a message from her best friend, Mia. Mia. Still at the café? How did it go? Karen stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. How could she explain what had just happened? That she had gone in prepared for a fight and left with more questions than answers. After a moment, she typed a brief response. Karen. It was complicated. Let's talk later. Sliding her phone back into her pocket, Karen exited the bookstore and continued down the street. She clutched the bag containing the book tightly, as if it were a tether keeping her grounded. The conversation with James had left her feeling raw, vulnerable in a way she hadn't anticipated. She stopped at a park bench and sat down, the cold wood seeping through her coat. Pulling the book from the bag, she opened it to the first page and began to read. The words came alive immediately. A soldier recounting the chaos of a battlefield, the desperate attempt to save a friend, the haunting sound of cries that never stopped. It was brutal, unflinching, and utterly human. Karen's breath hitched as she read on. She thought of James, of the stories he had shared, of the way his voice had cracked when he spoke about the boy with the injured dog. She had wanted to hate him, to see him as part of the problem, but now she wasn't so sure. The book, much like James, refused to offer easy answers. Instead, it asked hard questions and left her to wrestle with them. Her phone buzzed again, and this time it was a notification from a social media app. Karen hesitated before opening it, knowing it would pull her back into the chaos of opinions and arguments she had been immersed in before meeting James. She scrolled through her feed, seeing posts that now seemed shallow in their certainty, their quickness to judge without understanding. One post in particular caught her eye, a heated debate about veterans and their role in war. Karen's instinct was to jump in, to make her voice heard, but she paused. She thought about James's words, about the gray areas he had spoken of, and she realized she didn't have the clarity she once thought she had. Instead, she typed something unexpected. Karen, maybe it's more complicated than we think. Maybe we need to listen more. She hit send before she could overthink it and placed her phone back in her pocket. The act felt small, almost insignificant, but it was a start. Karen wasn't sure where this new understanding would lead her, but she knew she couldn't go back to the way she had thought before. The book sat heavy in her lap as she sat on the bench, watching the world move around her. The questions James had posed, the challenges he had made to her worldview, wouldn't be answered in a day. But Karen was beginning to understand that the answers weren't the point. The willingness to ask, to listen, to wrestle with the hard truths, that was what mattered. As she rose from the bench and began walking again, Karen felt a strange sense of peace. The world was no less complicated than it had been that morning, but for the first time, she felt like she was moving through it with her eyes open. The sunlight peeked through the clouds, warming her face briefly as she looked upward. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her that even the heaviest skies cleared eventually. Karen smiled faintly, clutching the book tightly as she continued on her way. Weeks passed, but Karen couldn't stop thinking about her conversation with James. His words lingered in her mind like a melody she couldn't shake. She had gone to that café expecting to solidify her convictions, to confront a man she believed represented everything wrong with the world. Instead, she had left questioning not just him, but herself. Karen read reflections of the front lines in small bursts, unable to take more than a few pages at a time. The stories were raw and real. They reminded her of James, not just his words but the weight he carried. She couldn't shake the image of him sitting across from her, his calm voice weaving stories that defied the neat categories she had once relied on. One night, as she sat by her window with the book in her lap, she decided to reach out. She opened her phone, scrolling to their brief exchange of messages when they had arranged to meet. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before she typed, "Karen. Hi, James. I've been thinking a lot about our talk. Would you be open to meeting again?" The message felt like a gamble, but she sent it anyway. A few minutes later, her phone buzzed with his reply. James. "Of course, same place?" Karen smiled faintly, her heart a mix of nerves and relief. They agreed to meet the following Saturday. The café was just as bustling as before, but Karen felt calmer this time. She arrived early, taking the same seat by the window and cradling a warm cup of tea. She had no agenda for this meeting, no arguments to make. She just wanted to talk. James arrived precisely on time, as steady and composed as she remembered. He greeted her with a nod and sat across from her, his expression open but curious. "I wasn't sure I'd hear from you again," he admitted after a moment. Karen smiled, a bit sheepishly. "Honestly, I wasn't sure either, but I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about listening. I realize there's a lot I still don't understand." James nodded. Understanding takes time, but it's worth the effort. They talked for hours, their conversation flowing easily. Karen asked James more about his experiences, what it was like to return home after the war, how he found meaning in his work with veterans, and whether he ever truly found peace. His answers weren't always simple, but they were honest. "What do you do?" Karen asked at one point, "when the guilt feels too heavy?" James considered her question carefully. "I remind myself why I feel it in the first place. Guilt means I care, that I'm not numb to the impact of my actions. It's not about letting it consume you, it's about letting it guide you to be better." Karen nodded slowly, her chest tightening. She thought about her own guilt, the assumptions she had made, the judgments she had passed so easily. It wasn't the same as James's, but it felt heavy all the same. As the afternoon wore on, their conversation shifted. Karen found herself opening up in ways she hadn't expected, sharing stories about her own struggles to make sense of the world. James listened intently, his calm presence making it easy to be vulnerable. By the time they parted, Karen felt lighter, as if she had shed a layer of the cynicism she hadn't realized she was carrying. She thanked James for meeting her again, and he responded with a small, knowing smile. "We all have something to learn," he said simply. Karen walked home that evening with a renewed sense of purpose. The streets were quiet, the city lights glowing softly against the backdrop of the dark sky. She thought about the many conversations she'd had in her life, quick, shallow exchanges that rarely scratched the surface. But her talks with James had been different. They had pushed her to look deeper, to ask questions she had been too afraid or too stubborn to ask before. The book sat heavy in her bag, a constant reminder of the stories she had yet to read, the lessons she had yet to learn. She realized now that understanding wasn't a destination. It was a process, an ongoing journey that required patience, humility, and a willingness to see the world through someone else's eyes. As Karen neared her apartment, she paused by a small park she often walked past but rarely entered. The benches were empty, the air still. She sat down and tilted her face upward, watching as the clouds shifted to reveal the stars. It struck her how small she felt in that moment, not in a way that diminished her, but in a way that connected her to something far greater than herself. Her phone buzzed softly in her pocket, breaking the stillness. She pulled it out and saw a notification, a reply to the post she had made earlier in the week about listening. The response was simple but thoughtful. "You're right. We could all do better." Karen smiled to herself, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She didn't feel the need to reply. Some things, she realized, didn't require a response. Sometimes it was enough to plant a seed and let it grow on its own. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the cool night air wash over her. When she opened them, she felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in years. The world was no less complicated than it had been that morning, but it felt less daunting. She wasn't alone in her journey, and that made all the difference. Karen rose from the bench, slipping her phone back into her pocket. She looked up at the sky one last time before turning toward home. The stars above seemed brighter somehow, their light cutting through the darkness with quiet determination. And for the first time in a long while, Karen felt the same.